966.
We're pleased to be speaking now with Phillip Cornell, a specialist on energy and foreign policy, energy security strategy, and Saudi Arabia with the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Phillip, thank you so much for joining us today on the 966.
Thanks very much, Lucian. It's nice to be here.
Phil, you're such a humble and unassuming guy. I wouldn't have, if you don't look at your bio, you don't understand how impressive your background is. So let me do this real quickly, because the initial impetus to get together was that you are senior editor and principal for energy and sustainability at the Economist Impact unit. And you're also, this unit recently put out a sizing of the energy transition. I guess it was October 2021, a fascinating a project and report, and you were project director and co-author of that. And I recommend it not only because it's a really good read, because it also comes with a really useful infographic version. In addition to the
shortest read,
the actual report. And I want to thank you for that, as senior editor and project director, for providing the infographic. That alone is worth it. But in addition to your work at the EIU, as Lucian mentioned, your Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, but your background is deep. You've been at Saudi Aramco, you've been at the International Energy Agency, you've been with NATO, Naval Postgraduate School, Royal United Services Institute in London, Center for International Security and Cooperation, Stanford, and of course a fellow graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS. But it's just extraordinary. So I want to come back. We talked a little bit yesterday. I want to end with that sizing the energy transition and aspects of that. I want to start with your extremely considerate move of traveling to the Emirates and attending and participating in a number of conferences and meetings just so you could bring that information to the 966 podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about the tone and the temper in the Emirates at this very fraught moment, both globally with the Ukraine situation, the global energy issues, and also, of course, the relationship with the U.S.?
Sure, Richard. Thanks. I'm happy to be the 966 roving reporter abroad for you. This was a really interesting trip. It's been a really busy couple of weeks, I think, across the region, at least on sort of the, global meeting scene. This started with a couple of weeks ago. There was the Doha Forum in Qatar. And then last week in Dubai, there was both the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum, and that was also kind of held within the same venue as the World Government Summit that the UAE put on, that was talking about sort of all sorts of future of the economy and governance. And of course, this was all, right on the premises of Expo 2020, which was in its last week. So it was all this kind of denouement that had been planned for a while. But it was also really well timed for big events that have been going on in the world. I mean, it's been a busy first quarter in 2022 right across the board. And I would say, to your point, the feeling in the region was one of a lot of confidence, I think, given their sort of positioning right now. Now, we all know that, in the context of the Ukraine conflict and the effective removal of barrels from the market as a result of self-sanctioning on parts of some oil companies, and also just a lot of trepidation about what actual sanctions are and how they're going to develop when it comes to Russian energy, there's been a lot of calls to those countries where spare capacity exists. And in reality, that's really Saudi and the UAE and a couple of others in OPEC, but those are the big ones. From Western governments, including from Washington, to up production, and those have been pretty much rebuffed. And so the meetings that were happening now about, the resurgence of the importance of energy security, what does, cooperation between the West and the Gulf look like around energy and energy supply, and how has that changed, I think, was really kind of at the forefront. For, let's say, a lot of people, I think, that are in the U.S. government right now, or in this current administration, I think there was kind of a across the board hope for a return to quote unquote normalcy from, before the last administration. And I think that between that and COVID, the real changes that have gone on in the world, and particularly in the relationship between the US and sort of its Gulf partners over the past 5 years, maybe it hadn't fully been grasped until this moment. And, listening to Al Mansouri, the Minister of Energy of the UAE, and also Prince Abdulaziz, his counterpart in Saudi Arabia, their approach to this sort of ask, I think, was, pretty direct. It was, we're not going to politicize energy production in OPEC. We don't see a physical oil disruption going on, even though, I think the reality is that's kind of a lame excuse. There's at least about 1.5 million barrels off the market functionally as a result of self-sanctioning. And then, on top of that, again, this is not something that we want to politicize. I think that those were the official kind of explanations. But underlying those were a lot of frustrations that had been building up for a long time over the past several years, and also coming to a sort of culminating. Most recently, we can work backwards. Most recently was this sense of the U.S. in particular not playing such an effective role in terms of guaranteeing regional security as it could, particularly around the missile strikes on civilian targets that were sent by the Houthis, both on UAE and Saudi soil. Further back from there was also, I think, if we look at COP26, a kind of aggressive rhetoric that was not just pro-energy transition, but sometimes really kind of anti-oil, anti-producer. They made it very clear that they had been made to feel unwelcome at COP26, and this sort of process that a lot of Western countries have been going through of dealing with the energy transition first by sort of attacking the bad guys, or making it into a good guy, bad guy thing, and saying, okay, we're now going to put lots of pressure on fossil fuel producers before having actually, made the transition both on the demand side or on whatever kind of alternative fuel side happen, means that, we're kind of in a bind now. But it means that has also, in a political sense, has sort of fallen on regional producers. And I would say, look, this also follows an entire decade of what we have considered what we've lived through in terms of energy abundance on the back of unconventional oil and gas in production in the US. And sort of this idea that's helped to create fertile ground for the idea that the energy transition could happen relatively quickly, relatively painlessly, at least in the way that we sometimes describe this to voters. And I think a broader kind of sense that in the context of this energy transition, that maybe, the relationship with the Middle East is not as central as it was before, or maybe not as critical as it had been before. And I think that those noises have been falling on the region for a long time. And this is really a moment to say, look, now, energy security is back. We need, you need cooperation in terms of the energy market. And I think that puts them in a position where going into also, by the way, a big super cycle of commodities, including energy, that's going to last for a couple of years. They're feeling strong, not only in sort of their, revenue base when it comes to traditional fossil fuels, but also in the successes and the advances of their programs to transition away from energy that was sort of, driven by that period in the middle of the last decade, where revenues were much lower. It was clearly an urgent need to move on, and all of the investments that they've been putting into advanced technology, into also clean tech and clean energy industry, all these kind of future industries that were, by the way, really on display at Expo 2020. between the confidence in the future and the confidence in how their economy is doing now, I think that they felt very much in a position to say, we're not going to walk away from a deal with Russia that, by the way, is kind of, for someone like Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, was kind of a personal project in a lot of ways. And we're not going to turn our production strategy just on the basis of Western geopolitical decisions. So this was kind of the sense that we all came into the region with. So a lot of confidence, a lot of optimism, but feeling that strength to be able to kind of put their foot down after quite a couple of years, and particularly this year, of feeling snubbed to some degree.
It's interesting to hear you frame it that way, Phil. I see it very much a sense of really growing confidence. And you look at Saudi Arabia. You're talking about the Emirates, but you're talking about Saudi Arabia too. And you look at the arc of MBS from when King Salman became king in 2015, when MBS was named crown prince in June 2017. When you look at the crises they were going through, 2017 you had the Qatar diplomatic crisis. 2017 you had the Ritz-Carlton detention. 2018, the VAT was introduced, which was controversial and quite daring. As we recall, the IMF was stunned. I said, why are you doing, well, you're at 5% initially, but then when they jumped it up in 2020 to 15%, that's quite aggressive. And of course, in 2018, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. So you have a very bumpy period, but what you have now in Saudi Arabia, and we're just looking at Saudi Arabia, is coming out of a really well-handled COVID pandemic, a really expanding, healthy non-oil economy. Of course, as you said, a super cycle in terms of commodities and oil in particular. Tremendous amount of confidence. A sense, at least in Saudi Arabia, I think, from the leadership that, okay, we're making some real strides. We've done some significant things on the social side. We're looking quite good, especially as compared to how bleak things looked in late 2014 in terms of our budget and everything else. And it appears to have given them a comfort level to turn and look at the U.S. and say, hey, we have some issues with the way you look at this relationship. We think it's outdated. Mm-hmm. We think it's a bit reactionary, and we think you're taking us for granted.
Yeah. I think some of the sort of phrases that I heard bandied about sort of off the record were things like, very great friends, but are we still allies, as we were previously? And that's a huge break, right? That's a huge change in tone. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, if you look at, talk to younger people in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE for a long time, but in Saudi Arabia, particularly over the last, 4 years or so, there's a huge amount of optimism in terms of the growth that's happening inside the kingdom, physical changes to infrastructure and daily life, which is just so different than it was, when I last lived there in 2016. I mean, it's a completely changed landscape. And yeah, I think a lot of this gives rise to this idea. Look, if our future in the non-oil economy is focused on these sort of critical areas around cyber, around artificial intelligence, around high technologies, around high-tech clean energy, I think there's also a question, are there other partners out there that can support that kind of growth in a way that the sort of traditional partnership with the U.S. Might not be able to, right? And that's sort of a fundamental questioning of the U.S. capacity to lead, even in those kind of high-tech areas where I think the U.S. has been a leader out of Silicon Valley for a long time, but there's a lot of serious competitors, not just in China, but even in smaller other players that can lend aid to that development on a more ad hoc basis. And I'm thinking about places like Israel. And if you saw sort of the meeting in the Negev that happened last week, where Anthony Blinken seemed like almost not an afterthought, but sort of the last guest invited, and sort of the kind of body language between the UAE and Israel in particular. You can see that there's new partnerships that are out there, and that kind of transactionalism is something I think that they're becoming more comfortable with. And that includes in the relationship with the U.S. And I think if you, again, going back to that kind of mindset shift, which is perhaps coming slightly later to Washington, I think that's also because, as I said, you have people, I think, inside the administration, really even just at sort of working level, that have come in with the administration, that for whom, Saudi Arabia is kind of it's sort of they have thinking of old cliches of Saudi Arabia, right? And so things like human rights, things like Khashoggi is very front of mind in terms of central in the relationship on something like that. And I think now it's coming to the moment where they realize, okay, that partnership is a little bit more complex, and it's perhaps not as one-sided as things had seemed at the end and the middle of the last decade.
Well, it's a question I've asked a number of times on this podcast: is there anybody in the U.S. government who is advocating for a change of perspective and a better effort at trying to meet these economies, these regimes, where they are now, not where they have been, and not based entirely on our past paradigms of energy and security. So on that side, I've been disappointed with the U.S. approach, and I think Biden, as you say, that administration has been playing catch up, and they, a lot of envoys are going out there, I think, trying to understand, and why are you so upset, and I think from the regional perspective is going, well, what do you mean, why are we so upset? Why aren't you paying attention? Why are you surprised we're upset after a whole series of what we think are faux pas and strategic mistakes, and basically ignoring us? On the flip side, was there any discussion in your visits and your talks about the sort of trying to square the circle, in that the fact is these countries, these regimes, UAE, Saudi Arabia, really need the global legal order that is advocated and sustained in many parts by the United States in order for them to thrive. While at the same time, they're very attracted to the economic sort of we'll leave you alone, we're not worried about anything else, transactional nature that you get with China in particular. Same sort of thing with Russia in different fields. So yes, they see it as a multinational world, but as we mentioned the other day, if this were a Russian global order, UAE wouldn't exist. It would have been annexed. Kuwait obviously would be a province of Iraq. Mm-hmm. Has the discussion gotten to that point, or is it still at this point grievance? You're not paying attention.
So answer to sort of the two comments you made. I mean, on the first one, I definitely do think that there are people in the U.S. government that know the region well, that have seen this transformation. And they exist, but I think a lot of the missteps that were taken as slights, particularly earlier this year, a lot of them were kind of own goals on the side of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they were just problems in how they communicate, mm-hmm. and how they show up and show show the Saudis in particular, and the UAE, the gravity that they take the attacks to have been. And I think when they realized, how egregious that was kind of seen to be on the part of in the region, they tried to, as you say, play catch up, right? So they sent in F-35s a little bit late. They sent envoys over a little bit late, so I don't think. I mean, I think that that there's sort of a dawning and a realization that's happening. I think it's kind of more missteps than it is something that's sort of that's too structural. On the other side, yeah, absolutely. Look, there's no question that the expansion of sort of the regional economy, both during the period of relatively high oil prices in the first decade of the 21st century, but also in terms of the big changes that we've seen in the second decade, given particularly all the mobilization of not only capital but also sort of technology transfer and investment by Western companies. A lot of that has absolutely been facilitated by an overall kind of legal geopolitical order in which the U.S. maintains some kind of sense of the international system as it stands. I think the idea that sort of an international system without that kind of organization, one that's because all of this is happening in the context of the sense of deglobalization, right? The sense that trade barriers are going up for different reasons, all across the world. I would say, you have on one side, at least when it comes to energy, on one side you have from sort of the sort of security aspect and sort of, I think, more the conservative side, you might have questions, can we do business with X, Y, and Z kind of political entities? Should we be imposing sanctions, as a strong measure of geopolitical leverage? And what we've been doing to Russia has been a sign that that can happen at a very high level with a very large economy. But also it's coming from the other side, from sort of the climate concern when we think about the rise of carbon border adjustment mechanisms or carbon tariffs. And so for all these reasons, we're starting to differentiate between trading partners and between different kinds of, the cleanliness of certain products. So what's clean oil or dirtier oil, or clean energy or dirtier energy in trade in a way that hadn't been the case previously. So, what does that world look like? And how do you sort of choose your trading partners? I think you're exactly right that, some of the alternatives, including the Chinese, I mean, we've seen the way that, particularly in the context of Belt and Road, that they come with a lot of good investment. And if I'm just thinking about the energy space, providing, I think, all of smart meters in Saudi Arabia, buying up, half of the Omani power grid, huge, obviously, investments in other kind of chemicals and infrastructure in the region. Often those comes with strings, whether they're visible or less visible, and they certainly come with strings around credit that can cause sort of problems about political leverage going forward, and that's what has been instigating the sort of, again, maybe a little bit catch-up move from the U.S. in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, in terms of standing up a stronger DFC in order to sort of have our own strategy about how we help countries to finance infrastructure build and technology advancement. So I think that there's two models out there. One certainly, I think, provides a more sort of long-term. I mean, if you're going to get in bed with a superpower, I think still better to be in bed with the U.S. But the alternatives are there, and they're attractive. And I think that, at least from the point of view of Washington, that's not something that we can ignore.
Well, it is fascinating when you bring up so many different factors like ESG, and how that changes investment perspectives. And we are, it seems, at a pivot point where there's, I don't want to make light of it. It's not like marriage counseling, but we're at a pivot point in a relationship where communication has not been good. Expectations for one party in particular have changed. And, some attention needs to be paid to this. And your reference to the EIA, I'm sorry. No, the IEA is interesting because Saudi Arabia, for example, just recently sort of excluded it from their basket of analysis that they're going to use for their pricing and that sort of thing. There's 5, now 7 that they pull from us. It's no big deal. But in the past, they would have sort of just sucked it up and said, okay, we're not appreciative of the way you're looking at us. We don't think your recommendation that there be no investment in oil and gas in order for us to achieve zero emissions by a certain date is helpful. We don't like how you've dismissed our circular carbon economy ideas and carbon capture initiatives and that sort of thing. And in the past, they might have just sort of gone, okay, well, that's kind of irritating, but we're not going to say anything. No longer.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we also have to accept that this conversation has been accelerating in the West a lot in very recent, in a short amount of time, particularly in Europe, but also here. So, you mentioned ESG. I mean, if, looking forward into 2022, I mean, the degree to which corporate leaders are now are under pressure and under, I wouldn't say beholden, but under a lot of pressure from shareholders, from consumers, from investors, from various stakeholders to adopt extremely ambitious sort of climate targets, and now are having to figure out exactly how to make those happen and to implement, is causing a lot of changes. And it starts in the energy industry, right? I mean, just from a legal perspective around ESG, the kind of pressures, that you've seen, for example, sort of new legal definitions that have driven cases like in Holland, against Shell, right, where they became legally responsible to reduce sort of carbon, have led a lot of those companies to actually make strategies that are going to reduce their oil and gas output, as well as shift to alternative technologies. That's, again, great over the longer run. As you said, it kind of plays into this IEA net zero narrative that we should not need new investment if we went on this net zero. I mean, I think that comment in the World Energy Outlook has been mistaken a lot in the press for saying, we should not be investing anymore, but it's saying if we go on this path properly, no new investment should be needed. But we're not on that pathway properly. Mm-hmm. And that because we're not attacking the demand side, the growth of alternatives is not rising as fast as it should. And so as we decrease the supply willingly out of the sort of IOCs and from the West, what it's actually doing is just putting much more market share over the next 10 years to producers that are willing to invest. And what it means, and I would couple that also, by the way, with capital discipline that we see sort of in the unconventional oil patch in the U.S. And, that's not because of any kind of regulations that the Biden administration is putting on at all. It's literally just producers there who got really burned when they recycled a lot of their revenues into new production a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so now they'd much rather pay it out in dividends and just sort of take the cautious route. And that means that the only investment that's going to happen is in places like in OPEC, where investments have been going in strong because they do see a long-term viability for those investments, or at least a medium-term viability for those investments through this super cycle, and even after the super cycle, as they start to have a much bigger part of maybe a shrinking pie. Even that is unsure, right? I mean, even 2 years ago, BP was saying this could be the demand plateau. We might have reached, that sort of point. Doesn't look to be the case. And that was also coming up, by the way, last week in all the discussions of the oil market. Demand just keeps rising. And so it sort of gives them a chance to sit pretty.
Yeah, these national oil companies, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, who are expanding crude oil production, must look around and go, oh, my goodness, this is quite the sweet spot, with shale still on the sidelines. Well, it's expanding, but slowly getting off the sidelines, and you're right. The IEA, in their scenarios, even by 2050, you still have 25 million barrels a day, of crude oil being produced.
40 maybe, yeah, a lot.
All right, so let's do this. I know we have limited time with you, Phil, so I want to get to it because you're not only you do a very good job in sort of doing big picture stuff, you also do you're always very informed on the mechanical stuff, the pragmatic, execution. And so the IEA, I think their prediction of the Russian oil production slump is 3 million barrels a day. I think, as you're talking about, it's more like 1.5 million barrels a day. But that aside, the U.S. just announced that its allies are going to deploy another 60 million barrels out of their strategic petroleum reserves to add to the U.S. 180 million barrel commitment. And I guess that's 1 million barrels a day from the U.S. and then add another 60. Will this make much of an impact?
Yeah. So Yes. I mean, what we have now are strategic stocks. That's sort of, when I was at the IEA, I was running sort of basically wargaming for fossil fuel supply crises, right? And you basically got three tools. You got your strategic stocks, you have fuel switching, and you have sort of management of demand. And strategic stocks are the first place to go. As you said, just yesterday, we heard that the international community is going to add 60 million barrels on top of the U.S. 60 million barrels in this release, and that's on top of the release that the U.S. announced a couple of weeks ago. It will make a big difference. It has sort of shifted oil prices a little bit, but over the long run, there's only a certain amount of reserves that are there, and we are, this is always the question about how you use strategic stocks. We're also, we've got to leave some dry powder there because the impact and the market impact of using that tool diminishes as sort of the size of the stock gets smaller. So, and as the outlook for how long the crisis is going to last, and that's really what our problem is right now, Richard. It's that the outlook is so uncertain about how long this crisis is going to last. What does a post-crisis market look like, and what does sort of the post-crisis political arrangement look like, particularly with the Russians? And in the much shorter term, what are sanctions actually going to look like going forward, right? So, we talk about this 1.5-ish million barrels a day just of self-sanctioning, but the Europeans are getting together again, and right now they're debating what is the next step. And particularly after the latest round of clear war crimes coming out of Ukraine, there's a whole lot of pressure to address Russian energy imports and whether to ban them, right? Which is a pretty extreme move, which had huge impacts, particularly on the gas side for European consumers. But in the meantime, what can we do? Maybe to not ban Russian oil? Are there sort of intermediary steps? I put out and we put out from the Atlantic Council a proposition about this about 3 weeks ago at the very early stages of the crisis about the viability of a oil import tariff, a punitive oil import tariff on the Russians. One of several different options of how we can basically keep the molecules flowing to the market while basically cutting off the rent to the Russian state. But the point here is we don't know, right? If we go to a full ban, we could be talking about a much larger impact in terms of global oil production and oil onto the market, and also a much longer, if that also carries over into a gas, maybe on the part of the Russians, they ban their own gas from going to European consumers, then something that lasts much longer, potentially into next year. So the market is grappling with this kind of uncertainty, and this is one of the reasons why the administration wanted so much to get positive noises, at least out of Gulf partners, to kind of calm the market. I mean, we saw, just a couple of weeks ago, comments by an ambassador, Saudi ambassador, that maybe they would consider something. And right away, prices dropped almost $10. So the market's on tenterhooks waiting for any kind of signal about what's coming next. And I think that's really what's driving a lot of the high prices now. So even if you release strategic stocks, it gives people a little, okay, at least there's a backstop. But the market is, still looking at everything from, everything from just basically things finishing relatively soon to pretty bad case scenarios down the line. And I think that's really what's causing a lot of the problem.
Yeah, and you can see why OPEC Plus, or not the Russians, but Saudis and the Emiratis, are inclined to stand pat at the moment because they don't know. Hard to predict. So let's talk about the European situation and the U.S. President Biden recently agreed with the EU to try and provide an additional 15 billion cubic tons of LNG through the remainder of 2022 and eventually increasing supply to Europe to 15 billion cubic tons annually through 2030. Is that possible? Can we do that?
Yeah, well, so what we're really talking about is, the Europeans are, again, on the gas side, trying to grapple with different kind of scenarios that might come out of the Russian situation. And given that, Russia supplies about 40% of European gas, that means that cutting it off altogether would have massive implications, particularly in Eastern European and Central European economies, that really rely on that. I think that there's an irony here that, countries like Poland or the Baltics or some in Southeast Europe that would actually, where 100% of their gas is coming from Gazprom, are some of the most gung-ho about a full gas ban. And so what we're actually talking about here is Germany and the German voter. And this question about whether, they sort of wring their hands about whether a full gas import ban would raise prices so much on German consumers that it would turn them against support for Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's not, mince words. European gas prices have been off the chart in the last couple of months. Again, just based on this kind of panic, right? Like people saying, get any cargoes we can now and lock them in. And on an oil barrel equivalent, that's driven sort of German border prices for gas up to like $600 a barrel or something like that, just to give you an idea of that growth. I mean, it's totally decoupled from the realities of the market, which is why you've seen a lot of questions about what do we do in the case that this happens, and how do we affect the market in the short term. So what do you do in the case that it happens? Again, I talked about those three tools you have for supply prices. Well, the Europeans have come out with a plan that at least by the end of the year, they think that they can reduce their reliance on Russian imports by like 2/3. That was on top of an IEA plan that had come out a couple of days earlier about how to reduce it by about 1/3. So the Europeans were much more ambitious. Most of that is taking LNG cargoes, rerouting LNG cargoes off the market. So one of the things that the US has been doing along with Europeans is going around to producers like the Qataris, but also very much to other consumers. So mostly that's sort of the Japanese and a lot of other Asian consumers in order to reroute some of those cargoes, because these are often on long-term contracts. There's a little bit of spot LNG, but it's a very thin part of the market. And how do we think about rerouting those? So part of that Biden agreement with the Russians was, a lot of that was rerouted LNG cargoes that they thought they could get over to Europe. Part of that, and so then we talk about there's short term, there's medium term, and long term. In the short term, you reroute those cargoes, and there's only so much that you can do. And even if, the prices might go up, but it's basically, that means that Europeans are outbidding Bangladeshis, right. Thais, this gas is still needed in other part of the world. And I think one of the sad parts of this entire crisis is that we're not talking about the huge ripple effects that are happening in the developed world, developing countries, in terms of inflated food prices, inflated energy prices, lack of access to these things because rich countries in a panic are going to start siphoning them off. So let's remember that when we think about extra cargoes that we're bringing into Europe. In the more medium term, we are, increasing LNG production in the U.S. And this is, the U.S. is obviously trying to position itself, or at least a lot of the U.S. sector, as the new strategic supplier, right? Because Europe is going to try to wean themselves on Russian gas, despite what happens. I mean, even in the best case scenario in Russia, a lot of European countries and we're done with Russian gas. So the U.S. becomes a new, hey, we got all this LNG that we can bring to the market. There's a lot more that's going to be coming online in the next year or two. The U.S. is going to be the largest LNG exporter by the end of the year. So some of it comes from there, but that's more of a 1, 2, 3, 4 year kind of outlook. And so, yeah, the Europeans are trying to deal with this crisis at the same time as they're trying to think about how do they wean themselves off Russian gas, let's say by 2025, 2026, 2030. And there the U.S. does end up playing a big role.
I think that's a really good point you make about the knock-on effects. And we're focused on the cost in the EU, but the cost increased globally and to economies that can't handle it nearly as well as the EU. So we've got a limited amount of time for you, about 10 minutes. I want to do as I promised and then get back to that EIU report on sizing the energy transition, which I think is outstanding, and I recommend it to everybody. And I want to point out that one of the reasons I think it was really fascinating is that it does two things. One, it puts a number to how much investment is needed in certain sectors, and two, it really emphasizes that a tremendous number of new jobs and new types of jobs will be created by this transition. So I think it's a useful read. So, but and again, I want to plug it. It talks about the power sector. It talks about greening the steel sector. It talks about driving decarbonization. But we're going to skip to clean hydrogen. and that's because it's something that Saudi Arabia is quite interested in. And I think I mentioned I was just up at the NEOM Roadshow in New York City earlier this week. One of the sessions was on hydrogen, and separately, Aqua, one of the leading power companies, is involved in the green hydrogen project with Air Products of the U.S. in NEOM. Just said they just announced a $900 million EPC contract to start the process. Mm-hmm. Can you give us and in a corollary, in blue hydrogen, Saudi Arabia is going to invest some $60 billion in the Jafurah gas plant that is expected to be a significant producer of blue hydrogen using carbon capture methods. So they're heavy into it. They really want to go hard into it. They believe there's a cycle here that they can take advantage of and come out on the other side as a leading global hydrogen producer. What's your take on all this?
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning the report, the Sizing the Energy Transition report. So we produced this basically in the run-up to COP26 for the Energy Transition Council, which is sort of a worldwide entity that was attached to the COP process. What we did was look at kind of a net zero scenario and think about what are the macroeconomic impacts that this kind of pathway can have for countries. And we look specifically at the G7 as well as China, India, and South Africa. And when it comes to, and we saw, for example, that there was, over 20 million jobs just in those four sectors that you mentioned, 4% of additional GDP. So it's a hugely expensive process, but one where the gains in terms of jobs, in terms of increased value and growth are certainly there. I think that in the Gulf region, as you mentioned, this has been sort of taken on board, and we talked earlier about the big progress that's been made on the clean energy space and how they're sort of banking a lot of their future growth on clean energy, both on renewable generation and with both between Aqua Power, Masdar. I mean, they're producing some of the lowest costs. I mean, we're almost breaking 1 cent per kilowatt bids for big utility scale renewable energy. But also, as you mentioned, on hydrogen, which, by the way, when we talk about the number of jobs, and we do this in this report that comes from big investments into hydrogen, most of that is actually in the renewable energy generation that you need to actually power to power the electrolyzers if we're talking about green hydrogen.
So the 4 billion, the 4 gigawatts of renewable energy required to produce energy is going to produce more jobs than the actual hydrogen production.
Right, exactly. So you mentioned the 4 gigawatt number. I mean, that's basically to power the NEOM green hydrogen project that's under discussion, under construction now. And precisely, I mean, just in order to run that one green hydrogen project, you're going to have to put in the equivalent, basically, of. I mean, if we look at the beginning of 2021, there was a few hundred megawatts of installed, utility scale solar in Saudi Arabia.
500 megawatts, and I think they're up to. They just may have just cracked 5 gigawatts by the end of this year.
Yeah, well, that's growing really fast, right? So between the Rabeg and Jeddah facilities that are going to the sort of photovoltaic IPPs that are going to be coming online just this year. But then Sudair, right, which is 1.5 gigawatts, producing at like 1.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So also at a pretty low amount. I mean, that's going to be coming online as well in the next few years. And Saudi wants to produce half of its electricity from clean energy by 2030, which is a big lift, but they're on the way there.
Their goal is 15 gigawatts by the end of 2023, and we had a nice conversation with Adam Saminsky at CapStark, former head of CapStark, and he was saying, it once it gets going, it's not linear. Okay. They've got a number of projects, and they feel like they'll be able to ramp it up pretty quickly. But the hydrogen play is all about obviously technology and making a market, because it's not blue hydrogen is profitable, but it's not. Green hydrogen is not profitable right now. So. What were the findings in terms of your report?
So in terms of the report, I mean, we looked at green hydrogen in particular. We looked at, well, we called it clean hydrogen, which included blue and green. And blue, let's remember, in terms of the color, just means that you're producing it from gas with carbon capture and storage. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, they had one of the first ammonia shipments based out of blue hydrogen production on the back of existing infrastructure and expertise that they have in abundance around sort of their gas infrastructure, particularly in the eastern province, and also carbon capture, increasing carbon capture experience. So, that's sort of the first step, is how do you ramp up blue hydrogen production in the kingdom and start to develop that market that you're talking about? Because at the same time as building hydrogen capacity and production capacity, you need the demand to be there. And this is where I would point to, one of the most sort of interesting and I think powerful programs that the US and John Kerry's team have put forward in the run-up to COP26, which is, encouraging very large corporates and manufacturers and global consumers to commit to buying clean hydrogen in order to develop that market. So what we see now, it's sort of this burgeoning market as we have new trade with sort of Japanese buyers, production in the Gulf, particularly with the latest infrastructure bill in the US, a hub that's likely to emerge somewhere in the US around hydrogen. That market is coming online. But as you said, green hydrogen just on the cost basis is we're talking about something that happens in the next 6, 7, 8 years that it really becomes commercially viable. There's a lot of public money. I mentioned Japan. Also in Europe, it's the Germans, and that are really putting a lot of cash into this. And so we found in our report, again, that there's progress that's being made. And if they can stick to this net zero trajectory, and we did look a lot to the IEA's net zero trajectory, but if green hydrogen can ramp up in the kind of speed, and you're right, it's a cascading effect, right? As these costs start to drop, then there's a lot of benefits out there, right? And we found that, cumulative investments for, in the US, China, Japan, of like $300 billion through 2030, could start to really develop this hydrogen value chain, even if green hydrogen isn't itself commercially viable until sort of the end of that period.
And is that realistic? That $300 billion number in terms of what you see out there?
Here and there. I mean, it's an industry which is coming up, right? So it's hard to tell right now. There's a lot of pilot projects that are sort of scattered around the world, and there's a lot of big commitments that have come from governments. I think the real trick is going to be, how can we mobilize private sector capital and financing around some of these projects? And you mentioned liquid products. There's also Air Liquide in France. There's a few big players that have been developing this hydrogen infrastructure, and we start to see that financing really coming online. And that gives me hope that we can get to that $300 billion figure, but it's ambitious. There's no question.
Phillip Cornell, specialist on energy foreign policy, joining us from Washington. Phillip, thank you so much for your time. What a great discussion.
Thanks a lot, Lucian and Richard. It's really a pleasure to join you guys.
Phil, just a tutorial, masterful tutorial. Thank you so much.